Welcome to Pax Britannica. Season 2, Episode 39, The Master of Scotland. Welcome back to Pax Britannica. I'm your host, Samuel Hume. Before we begin today, I'd like to thank my Patreon House of Lords, which has been joined by the Earl of Bath, or Bath, Geoffrey Tucker, Heather Bauman, Countess of Salisbury, and Baron Ollie. Like all other patrons, they can now listen to this and every other episode ad-free. Go to patreon.com/PaxBritannica to find out more. Last week, we followed James Graham, the Marquess of Montrose, and Alistair MacCollar as they rampaged through Scotland in the name of the king. Outnumbered, outgunned, and with few allies and supplies, the Royalists enjoyed 3 victories against the Covenanter regime. The Battle of Tippermuir, where Montrose's army was outnumbered 2-1. The Battle of Aberdeen, where Montrose's army was outnumbered 2-1. And the Battle of Inverlochy, where, say it with me, Montrose's army was outnumbered 2-1. Despite being outnumbered at each of these battles, the Royalists were determined and motivated, and many of them were hardened campaigners from Ireland, the Highlands, and the Islands. The armies they faced, while staffed with and supported by veterans from the main Covenanter army, well, they were mostly untested recruits and militia. They crumbled in the face of the terrifying Highland charge, which is understandable. Faced with a barrage of musket fire, Gallic battle cries, and a charging mass of claymore and axe-wielding killers, I would probably run away screaming too. We left off with the Battle of Inverlochy, where the Marquess of Argyll, Archibald Campbell, Chief of Clan Campbell, rode away from a battlefield choked with the corpses of his soldiers and clansmen. He was the effective leader of the Covenanter government, one of the most powerful nobles in the entire Kingdom of Scotland, and there he was, his arm in a sling, being rowed to safety. It was a devastating loss for both him personally and his government. But Argyll's humiliation wasn't over yet, because Montrose's year of victories wasn't over yet. If you're not keeping count, he still has 3 more victories to go. Battle 4, Oldern, the 9th of May, 1645. Despite Montrose's hope that his successes against the Covenanters would convince the Marquess of Huntly, the chief of Clan Gordon, to join him, Huntly remained in his hole in Sutherland. But not all of the Gordons remained so aloof. Lord Gordon, his nephew, suddenly switched sides. He'd sworn the Solemn League and Covenant he was Argyll's nephew, and he'd been with Argyll when the Marquess marched on Aberdeen to catch Montrose. But he'd opposed Argyll's brutal treatment of Gordon tenants, and promises of compensation only went so far. Allies of Montrose had been trying to persuade him to switch sides for months now, and it seems that when the news of Inverlochy reached him, that was the tipping point. Argyll was humiliated, the Campbells were in chaos, and Montrose seemed invincible. He arrived at Elgin, where Montrose had established a temporary headquarters, and he brought Gordon cavalry with him. His arrival was especially welcome because Montrose's army was forever short of horses. Montrose and Gordon became quite good friends, and around this time the Viscount of Boyne, another son of Huntly and the brother of Lord Gordon, arrived, and he rejoined the fight. Another turncoat from the cause of the Covenanters was the Earl of Seaforth. He arrived at Elgin, but Montrose didn't trust him, and he had him arrested. After Seaforth signed a band pledging to raise forces for the king, he was released, and sent to hold Inverness for Montrose. But either Montrose had been a good judge of character, or his rude welcome turned Seaforth off the Royalist cause, because when he reached Inverness, he returned to the Covenanter side. At the end of March, Montrose set off south with an army of 2,000 infantry and 2,000 cavalry, by far the largest army he'd commanded during the campaign so far. He marched south from Elgin through Aberdeenshire and looted and pillaged as he went. Again, poor Aberdeen. He reached the River Tay at the end of March, but a Covenanter army under Bailey blocked his path across. This was Lieutenant General William Bailey, who we met at the end of last week's episode when the Covenanter Executive, the Committee of Estates, hurriedly put him in command of another army and tasked him with stopping Montrose. With Montrose's Highlanders increasingly exhausted and agitated, Montrose planned to return north. He sent most of his army back north, but kept 200 cavalry and 800 infantry with him. He was going to loot Dundee. Damage to the walls meant that the city was quickly breached, and his army spent most of the day looting, drinking, and otherwise enjoying themselves. Dundee, in stark contrast to Aberdeen, would later receive a grant of almost £55,000 to make up for the looting. Then, around 5 p.m, Montrose received reports of Covenanter cavalry on the way. It's a testament to Montrose's character as a commander that he neither fled the city to save himself, as some of his subordinates urged, or allowed panic to set in among the men. His short-notice warning is another testament to his nature. Montrose would repeatedly fail to properly keep track of the enemy position, and it will cost him in time. But not this time. Montrose led an orderly retreat out of the city, with himself commanding a rearguard, and he kept his army in one piece. The cavalry, under the command of the appropriately named John Hurry, chased Montrose back north, only to find the position reversed once Montrose caught up with the rest of his army and turned around. Hurry then fought a series of rearguard actions until he reached the safety of Inverness on the 7th of May. With Seaforth's men, Hurry turned around and led almost 4,000 men to confront Montrose's 2,000 men. Montrose didn't keep his own 4,000-strong army for long. The weather was terrible, and Montrose's army was spread across the region looking for shelter from the rain. As the Covenanters advanced, someone had the bright idea to make sure the guns weren't clogged with rainwater. They test-fired their guns, and as the volley of shot rang out, the wind caught the sound and carried it far enough that Montrose's scouts heard. They rushed back to report this, and McCulloch prepared to buy enough time for the rest of the army to assemble. He and his men had been enjoying the shelter of Ohlmeyer village, and they prepared to hold out there. McCulloch happened to have the royal standard with him, and it was prominently displayed. So when Hurry arrived, and he saw this, he was convinced that the entire royalist army was present in the village. So he moved cautiously, and this bought Montrose even more time to move the actual army into position. After a brutal firefight on the outskirts of Worden, McCulloch's men were forced back, and the Covenanters took up positions in the village itself. But that brought them into an enfilade of musket fire from McCulloch's troops, as well as from another contingent of Montrose's musketeers. The fighting in the village was intense, with McCulloch attempting a counterattack, which was beaten back by the Covenanters. On the flanks, cavalry on both sides struggled to maneuver through the buildings and the fences. A cry went up from the infantry battle. McCulloch was running! Now, whether he was or not, that rumour would be lethal to morale. And so Montrose ordered a Boyne's cavalry and another regiment of infantry to join the fray and steady the line. Hurry ordered one of his own cavalry colonels into the fight, but for some reason, either panic or miscommunication or just incompetence, the officer led his cavalry in the wrong direction. Lord Gordon soon joined his brother, leading his own cavalry into the Covenanter flank, and that was it. Hurry's men retreated out of the village but continued to fight, but eventually, finally, the Covenanter morale broke and they fled back down the road to Inverness. The Battle of Worden was messy, and not just because of the mud. It hadn't started on Montrose's terms, and once again, his lack of information about the whereabouts of the enemy had almost caused disaster. Worden was a victory, but it was a Pyrrhic victory, and despite his desire to chase Hurry back to Inverness and take the city, he was in no position to do so. He needed to recover his losses. Hurry had lost between 500 to 1,000 men, but Montrose had also taken significant casualties. When Hurry rejoined Bailey, and they advanced on Montrose again, he slipped the net, and went on a recruiting drive. Battle 5. Alford, the 2nd of July, 1645. Montrose spent the rest of May and June gathering as much support and as many reinforcements as he could, while Bailey besieged Huntly Castle. The Marquess himself was still hiding in Strathnaver, waiting out the storm. By the end of June, Montrose felt that his army had recovered enough that he could take on Bailey's main force. Bailey would like nothing less. His army had just been weakened by order of the Committee of Estates. A decent chunk of his force was dispatched to join the Marquis of Argyll, who was advancing north, and this left Bailey with around 1,500 men. Montrose had more than 2,000. For once, Montrose had the advantage in numbers, and he was determined to use it. Montrose caught up with Bailey near Keith in northern Moray, and he formed up for battle. But Bailey took one look at the well-positioned Royalist army, which, again, outnumbered his, and thought better than to run straight into Montrose's guns. So Montrose then forced his hand. He began marching south, and Bailey was forced to follow him. When Montrose's army crossed the River Don at Forbes, he ordered his men to take up position behind a hill to the west of this crossing point, appropriately named Gallow Hill. Scouting ahead himself, Montrose saw Bailey's army approaching the ford at Alford, a little bit further east of where Montrose himself had crossed the Don. The positioning here is key. When Bailey crossed at Alford and continued down the road west towards Gallow Hill, he couldn't see past the rise of the hill. But as he marched his army closer, Montrose's Royalists began to appear at the top. With the Don to the north, running west to east, Bailey's room for manoeuvre was limited. It was an ambush. At first, neither side wanted to start the fight. Montrose was atop a hill, which would make any advance against him very dangerous. But Bailey was surrounded by the rough terrain of ditches and river marshes, not an easy target either. When the battle did begin, skirmishing between the cavalry on Montrose's right was fairly equal, until a contingent of Royalist musketeers threw down their guns, drew their daggers, and ran at the horses and the riders. They were joined in this unorthodox charge by Highlander archers, who didn't drop their bows, but instead started hitting the enemy cavalry with them and stabbing at them with their arrows. The enemy horse broke, and Montrose's right cavalry were able to loop behind the Covenanter lines to charge the Covenanter right from the rear, while Montrose's own left cavalry charged them from the front. With the Covenanter cavalry either routed or tied up, Montrose's infantry advanced against the enemy foot, for once having larger numbers. It was over quickly. The entire battle took about an hour, and after that, all that was left was the chase. The victorious Royalists chased the army until night fell. Bailey's army was effectively destroyed. Bailey himself blamed the interference of the politicians for the defeat. They had, after all, stripped him of his numbers advantage and pressured him to be aggressive in his chase. Frustrated by their clear lack of faith, he offered his resignation, but it was denied. Instead, the Committee of Estates ordered him to take command of what was, effectively, the last Covenanter field army in Scotland. Montrose had destroyed all the others. Montrose hadn't won without losses, and one of the most notable deaths at Alford was Lord Gordon, his newfound friend and one of the sons of Huntly. He'd been shot in the last actions of the battle while leading his cavalry. But the victory at Alford opened the way south to Montrose. Battle 6, Kilsyth, 15th of August, 1645. Alistair MacCulloch rejoined Montrose in his march. The islander had gone west again to raid the enemies of his family and gather more recruits, and he brought 1,600 men with him. Montrose then tried to take Perth, for old time's sake, but he was driven off by Bailey, now at the head of the last Covenanter field army. Montrose rendezvoused with the Viscount Aboyne at Dunkeld, and Aboyne brought with him another 400 cavalry and 800 infantry. Montrose now led the largest army he'd ever commanded, about 4,500 infantry and 500 cavalry. Now he decided to leave the Highlands and the northeast and take the fight to the Covenanter regime on its own ground. His target was the city of Glasgow. Glasgow was not the metropolis it is today. The economic explosion of the Atlantic slave trade and the Industrial Revolution is still some time off, but it was still one of the largest and wealthiest cities in Scotland. Montrose marched out of the Highlands, outmaneuvering Bailey's army and bypassing it, and continuing down the road. Bailey sped after him, though not too quickly. The ambush at Alford had made him cautious. He was a safe distance away when Montrose camped near Concise, about midway between Glasgow and Stirling. But Montrose also remembered Alford, for the exact same reasons. The ambush had worked perfectly and destroyed Bailey's last army. Maybe he could do it again. So Montrose led his army into the hills to the south of the road and waited for Bailey to blunder into his cunning trap. But Bailey was no fool, and he knew exactly what Montrose was trying. So he led his army off the road, to the north of where Montrose was hiding, and took up a position with a river protecting one flank and hills the other. In fact, from his new position, Bailey could see Montrose's army hiding. Nice try, James, but not this time. Bailey was content to sit and wait for Montrose to make the first move, either to continue his advance or come and face him in battle. But Bailey was not alone. He had several members of the Committee of Estates on hand, including Argyll. While Bailey was happy to wait, cautious of Montrose's ingenuity, they urged action. They pointed out that the hill to Bailey's north, which he was using to guard a flank, well, that was higher ground, wasn't it? Higher ground is good in a battle, yes? Why don't you take it? And while there's truth to that, Bailey didn't agree in this particular case. He was an experienced commander, with the power of two working eyes. He'd not missed the massive sodding hill. He'd considered the option and ruled it out. Quote, "I show them I did not conceive that ground to be good, and that the rebels might possess themselves of it before us." End quote. Better to stay in his strong position than risk moving to untested ground and risk the Royalists getting there first. But Bailey did not have the authority to stand his ground. He knew he was due to be replaced, and the presence of the committee just weakened his legitimacy as a commander even more. Argyll, who Bailey hated, asked him what he was going to do. Bitterly, Bailey responded that his opinion didn't matter. He would do what they told him. This was, as David Stevenson puts it, a sulky abdication of responsibility. Bailey gave the orders he was told to give, and his army began to move. And immediately, Bailey's fears began to manifest. His army was sluggish and uncoordinated. They'd been expecting to stay where they were. And when Montrose saw the confused movements of the enemy army, he ordered his men to strip down to only what they needed to fight. Extra layers of clothing would just slow them down and heat them up in a hot summer heat. Then he ordered them to take the hill, which Bailey was now moving his army onto. Quicker than the slower-moving Covenanters, who were keeping in formation, Montrose's infantry swarmed onto the higher ground. In the confusion, one of Bailey's subordinates began to advance in the wrong direction against orders. Bailey sent a runner to get him back into formation, but by then it was too late. McCulloch had engaged them, and men on both sides began flowing into the growing fight. Cavalry on both sides struggled with the terrain, and the key point of the battle came when a Boyne charged the enemy lines. His mounts were slowed by a stream and the heather, easy targets for the Covenanter musketeers, who peppered them with shot the whole way. A force of Covenanter cavalry countercharged a Boyne's exhausted and depleted horse, and successfully forced them away. But then they kept chasing, and they chased too far. Montrose's main body of cavalry then engaged them, and drove them from the field entirely. Now without cavalry support, the Covenanter infantry were attacked from the front and the flanks. McCulloch led a Highland charge which came upon the musketeers so quickly that the enemy didn't have a chance to fire. The line broke, and the battle was over. The Covenanter cavalry mostly escaped, but the infantry were chased and cut down relentlessly. The Committee of Estates fled, with some like Argyll running out of the country entirely. He went all the way to Newcastle, because he'd run out of armies in Scotland, and he hoped to borrow one from the Earl of Leven. After 2 days dealing with the aftermath of the Battle of Kilsyth, Montrose continued his march on Glasgow, and he took the city without a fight on the 16th of August. Under his authority as the king's Scottish representative, he sent out summons for a parliament. But then Montrose made a fateful choice. He refused to agree to McCulloch's demand that his islanders, Highlanders, and Irish be allowed to loot the city. A relief for the Glaswegians, absolutely, but Montrose's army had just emerged from a hard-fought victory. To all extents and purposes, the Covenanter regime was dead in the water, at least in Scotland. Montrose's cause had never been closer to victory, and his men believed that they deserved to be rewarded with the spoils of war. But Montrose said no. Over the next few weeks, Montrose hemorrhaged soldiers. Many of the rank and file who had been denied the chance to loot Glasgow melted away in the days after Montrose's decision, but the greatest blow came in early September. McCulloch had always been driven by different objectives than his commander, asserting familial rights, punishing the enemies of his family, and prizes for his men. Considering his job done, Montrose was now master of Scotland. McCulloch led his men back to the Western Highlands to fulfill his true passions, which were mostly killing Campbells and, well, that's about it, killing Campbells. But Montrose wasn't yet secure as master of Scotland. There was no army in Scotland which could oppose him in the field, but he was far from finished. There were plenty of garrisons across Scotland which were loyal to the Covenanter regime, and Edinburgh still stood unconquered. The Covenanter government still claimed it, and that needed to be fixed, especially if Montrose was going to hold a parliament there. So Montrose left Glasgow and marched on the capital. But then Montrose suffered another blow. Viscount Aboyne decided that this was the perfect time for him to leave Montrose too. Some accounts describe him feeling slighted after Kilsyth. Perhaps Montrose's skills as a diplomat had failed him. First McCulloch, and now Aboyne, had abandoned him. When Aboyne left, he took most of the Gordons with him, leaving Montrose with a meagre 500 foot and 100 horse. Montrose was only master of Scotland because the bulk of the Covenanter army was out of the kingdom. When it came back, and it will, and with a vengeance, his minuscule force, which is now smaller than when he started his campaign at Atholl, well, it would stand no chance. Recruitment from the lowlands was proving especially difficult. His previous reliance on McCulloch's Irish Catholics alienated many in the region, where anti-Irish and anti-Catholic feeling was very strong. Forming a legitimate government in the name of the king, which could damage the unity of the Covenanter cause, was his only chance. But Edinburgh was suffering from a bout of plague. Even if he did take it, he risked his health and the health of his army, and he would be a sitting duck when the Covenanters sent another army. Without Edinburgh, Montrose's fledgling government was denied the opportunity to gain legitimacy from holding a parliament in the capital. He could have held a parliament in Glasgow or anywhere else. Parliament is a people, not a place. But it would be an uphill battle. Rather than overthrowing the Covenanter government and imposing a royalist replacement on the kingdom, he would be creating an alternative government, a pretender government, and forcing the Scots to choose between them. With the Covenanters still controlling a massive army in England, and Montrose barely having an army at all, that would be an easy choice. Montrose had achieved so much, and it was all on the brink of meaning nothing at all. With his small army, Montrose decided that the best thing he could do for the king was to join him in England. As we'll cover in other episodes, Charles's England campaign was going from bad to worse, and Montrose realised that if he retreated further into Scotland to rebuild his army and continue his campaign, the king would be defeated in England, and any Scottish successes would be for nothing. So Montrose diverted away from Edinburgh and entered the borders, leaving the plague-stricken capital, as well as any chance to make something out of his year of victories, behind. I said at the beginning of the last episode that Montrose would enjoy 6 glorious victories. There will not be a 7th. Battle 7. Philiphaugh, 13th of September, 1645. On the 6th of September, someone else entered Scotland. One David Leslie, Lieutenant General of Horse in the army of both kingdoms. He crossed the border at Berwick, and he led at least 4,000 men, and these were mostly cavalry and dragoons, battle-hardened veterans of the English campaign. His force prioritised speed, and he had one particular objective in mind: to catch Montrose, bring him to battle, and destroy him and his pesky rebel army. He marched north, planning to catch Montrose in or near Edinburgh, but he soon received information that Montrose had never reached Edinburgh, and that he was in the borders as well, running for England. Leslie turned his army around. When Montrose learned that Leslie was on his tail, he swung his army west to try and avoid him, but as we'll see, he didn't shake his pursuer. Leslie left most of his infantry behind to catch up and raced after the fugitive would-be Master of Scotland. He caught up with his rearguard on the night of the 12th of September and routed them. Montrose had camped for the night in and around the town of Selkirk. His officers and cavalry were in the town, while most of his infantry were across a river called the Ettrick Water. When survivors from the Royalist rearguard arrived and reported that Leslie's army was only 3 miles away, for some reason, this didn't raise the alarm. For all of Montrose's strengths as a commander, as we've seen, his greatest weakness was in gathering, collecting, and using intelligence. In the morning, the Covenanter army came from the northeast, emerging out of a thick mist, advancing down the valley towards the divided Royalist army. The infantry were not prepared for a battle, and hurried to form into firing positions even as the Covenanters advanced on them. An initial Covenanter cavalry charge on Montrose's right wing was repulsed by the terrain and the determination of the Royalists' remaining Irish musketeers. But Leslie was no Argyll. He was a career soldier and an experienced commander, and he had split his cavalry force into 2. One half was contending with the Royalist right. The other had crossed the Ettrick, passed through Selkirk, looped around, and then recrossed the Ettrick behind the Royalist lines. And then they charged. When Leslie's cavalry smashed into the rear and flank of the Royalist lines, the game was up. Bishop Wishart, who had been with Montrose throughout the campaign, recorded that, quote, "For the foot there was little hope in flight. They stood firm and fought resolutely till offered quarter, when they threw down their arms and yielded. But, notwithstanding the promise of quarter, these defenceless men were every one butchered in cold blood by Leslie's own orders." End quote. Whether Montrose could have changed the outcome of the Battle of Philiphaugh is uncertain. He was massively outnumbered, but he'd won most of his battles while massively outnumbered. But what Montrose could have done, and should have done, was listen to his scouts, and prepare his army for either flight or for battle. At the very least, he should have been with the majority of his men when the battle began, but he was on the other side of the Ettrick, and by the time he joined them, there was only so much he could do. Montrose escaped Philiphaugh. He would flee into the Highlands and try and rebuild his army, but the fragile illusion of success was shattered. He struggled to recruit allies and soldiers, and he wasn't helped by the return of the Marquis of Huntly, who had finally emerged from his Sutherland sabbatical, and at the worst possible time. Perhaps he had decided to return to his estates on the belief that the Royalist cause was almost triumphant, and that he'd better not be hiding in Strathnaither when that happened. But by the time he'd landed in the northeast on the 4th of October, the whole situation had been reversed. Montrose tried to forge an alliance with Huntly to restore the king's cause in Scotland, but Huntly, for many reasons, was difficult. For starters, Huntly was jealous. While he had been hiding, the younger, bolder, more energetic Marquess had been winning victory after miraculous victory. He was seen to be the true protector of the Gordons, taking revenge on Covenanter tenants for Argyll's attacks on Gordon estates. 3 of Huntly's own sons had fought for Montrose, and 1 had died for him. And despite Montrose's commission clearly stating that Huntly was his subordinate, Huntly insisted that his own commission made him the superior officer in the north. It was a painful, frustrating relationship between the two men. In an effort to win Huntly over, Montrose was willing to compromise over who was in charge, offering him joint command, desperate to get someone who, on paper, should have been his closest and most powerful ally on side. But even then, Huntly rarely coordinated anything with Montrose. In May 1646, he would order an attack on Aberdeen, poor Aberdeen, and he took it. But like he had 2 years before, he did nothing with it. After a short occupation, he just left and retreated back to Gordon territory. Huntly wanted to be a great commander like Montrose, but he wasn't, and he hated that fact, and he hated the man who made him face that fact. The height of Huntly's pettiness might be when Charles, due to events we'll cover another time, ordered his Scottish supporters to disband. Montrose tried to meet with Huntly to discuss a shared strategy to ensure their forces weren't punished by the victorious Covenanter government. But Huntly just ran away again. He ran away while loudly proclaiming that he would follow the king's orders, unlike someone. But then, after Montrose negotiated terms for the safety of his men and his own exile, and then disbanded as per the orders of the king, Huntly declared that he'd stay in the field. Stevenson suggests that this was yet another attempt to present himself as a defiant, noble royalist in comparison to the now disbanded and exiled Montrose, but it's also very tedious. Staying with Huntly until 1647, because frankly we can jump that far ahead because none of what he does really affects the rest of the narrative, Huntly kept fighting for the king, and I use that word loosely, until April 1647. The Covenanters had sent an army against him, and so he ran away, disbanding his small army. In December that year, the Covenanters finally caught him, and he was imprisoned in Edinburgh. Huntly would remain in prison for another 2 years, doing what he apparently did best, sitting out important events. He'd stay there until March 1649, when the Scottish Parliament decided to enforce the sentence of death which had been passed in 1645. He was beheaded. In one final twist of the dagger, Montrose outlasted him. Thank you to my entire House of Lords, including a favourite of the King, Mike Sanders, the Duke of Ormond, Brendan Bonner, the Marquess of Finsbury Park, Chris Remo, and the Earl of Pembroke, David Simpson. Remember that every patron, regardless of rank, receives an RSS feed, which you can put in any podcast app to listen to the podcast ad-free. Thank you to everyone who has supported me on Patreon or donated through PayPal, left a review, or told a friend about the podcast. Thank you to Sounds Like an Earful for the interval music in today's episode, to my entire House of Lords, and to you for listening.